As we discussed at the end of the last video, many of the civil rights and civil liberties and freedoms that the freed slaves had after the Civil War ended in 1876 with the end of Reconstruction. And why was that? Well, basically that was because the Army left. When the Federal Army left, we have this situation where there's nobody there to protect these individuals. There's nobody there really to protect the desire of the federal government. The governments of the South began being turned back over to the hands of the people that were in control before the Civil War. When I first started thinking about this as an undergraduate, I asked the question, yes, the Federal Army was gone, but the 14th Amendment was still in place, saying that we had to treat all citizens equally. So what was the problem? How could these states continue to discriminate so obviously, so grossly against these freed slaves? Well, the basic reason is because of the new form of government that was created under the Constitution, federalism. What happens when the Federal Army leaves the state and they're no longer militarily occupying the states in the South? Now these states start to regain the sovereignty that they had prior to the Civil War. And one area that we will look at that the states really discriminated against African Americans was the area of voting. And remember, voting is a state power. And what happens is the state governments start passing state laws regulating voting, such as poll taxes, grandfather clauses, and wide primaries. Now, the 15th Amendment says you have to give everybody the right to vote. The way the Supreme Court interpreted that, basically, was that you have to give everybody the opportunity to vote. And the states would start doing things like passing poll taxes, which said everybody that wants to vote has to pay a poll tax. Well, who do we know that would not be able to afford to pay a poll tax? These freed slaves. At this time that the poll taxes are being passed, these freed slaves are barely being able to survive, let alone having extra money to pay a poll tax. They also had things called grandfather clauses and basically said you could vote in the state if your grandfather had the right to vote. Well, again, how many freed slaves had a grandfather that could vote? Very few. Now, we look at these laws that were passed, and we obviously see that these laws were written specifically to prevent African Americans from voting. But when these issues like poll taxes and grandfather clauses came to the U.S. Supreme Court after the end of Reconstruction, the U.S. Supreme Court said that poll taxes and grandfather clauses were constitutional because the 14th Amendment requires that we apply all laws equally to all citizens. And what the Supreme Court said was that every person who showed up to vote was asked to pay the poll tax. Every person that showed up to vote was asked to prove that their grandfather could vote. Literacy tests. Every person who showed up to vote was given a literacy test. So in the eyes of the Supreme Court, those laws were being equally applied to all citizens. That basically gave the state, at least in the area of elections or voting, lots of latitude on what they were allowed to do. Voting wasn't the only area where African Americans were discriminated against. When we look at society throughout the country, but primarily in the South, we see a whole series of laws that we call Jim Crow laws. And basically what Jim Crow laws were laws that were designed to keep African Americans separate from whites in all aspects of life. You had Jim Crow laws that mandated separate restrooms, separate water fountains. When you would go into movie theaters, you would have the African Americans in the balcony and the whites down below. When you would have a court case, you would have certain parts of the courtroom where African Americans were allowed to be and they weren't allowed to be. All aspects of life was segregated based on these laws that we know as Jim Crow. These were very much like the voting laws because what they were trying to do is they were trying to, on the surface, appear to be treating the African Americans equally, but actually were discriminating widely. Now, these Jim Crow laws were different than the black codes. The black codes were very, very clearly addressed in the Civil Rights Act of 1866. But these Jim Crow laws and these voting laws that were being passed were able to get around the Civil Rights Act of 1866 primarily because of this whole federalism form of government. There were certain areas of life that were put aside for the states to regulate and other parts of life for the federal government to regulate. And the Supreme Court would repeatedly say that issues such as the Jim Crow laws and those types of things were states' issues. Now, there are two particular Supreme Court rulings I want you to be familiar with, because a lot of times we as Americans blame the South. We blame Mississippi, we blame Alabama, we blame Louisiana for the discrimination that went on in the South. And yes, a lot of the blame lies with the states because they're the ones who passed the discriminatory laws. But we have to realize that the ability for the states to continue to discriminate was really based on two very basic Supreme Court rulings that were made. We have what's called the state action doctrine, and we have the separate but equal doctrine. Both of these are doctrines that the Supreme Court laid down in response to lawsuits claiming that the southern states were discriminating against African Americans. Let's go over these two doctrines. The state action doctrine basically says that the courts in this country have the right to regulate government actions. And remember, the word state can sometimes be used as a synonym for government. So in this case, basically what we're talking about here is the government action doctrine. Congress and the courts can regulate the activities of states. But if a private individual chose to discriminate, the courts were saying there was very little that the government could do. For example, if I owned a restaurant, and it was a privately owned restaurant, and I chose not to serve African Americans in my restaurant, should the government be able to come in and tell me you have to serve African Americans? The Supreme Court in 1883 said, no, it's a private facility owned by somebody, and they can serve who they choose to serve. If I own a movie theater and I want to make the African Americans sit up in the balcony and the Caucasians sit downstairs, then the Supreme Court says with the state action doctrine, as long as it's a privately owned movie theater, we don't have any right to go in there and tell you any different. And let's kind of use this doctrine in the current life. The Supreme Court continues to say that private institutions can discriminate. For example, there is a private university known as Liberty University that was created by Jerry Falwell. And Jerry Falwell says that the only people that he will allow to come to his schools are people that adhere to his Christian beliefs. The Supreme Court and the courts have repeatedly said he can do that. He's a private university. But now, the University of Notre Dame, which is also a private university, and it's a Catholic university, cannot say no to people that are Jewish or people that aren't Catholic. Even though it's a private institution, what the Supreme Court has said is that Notre Dame has chosen to accept federal loan money. And as soon as Notre Dame University accepts federal loan money, they become a quasi-governmental entity or a partially governmental entity. Liberty University, if I was to try to go to Liberty University and pay for my tuition with Pell Grant money, Liberty University would say no to me, because Liberty University understands that as soon as they accept government money, they become a quasi-governmental entity, and the courts can regulate their activities. So what the Supreme Court was saying in 1883 is as long as this institution is a private institution, they can discriminate. Or so much of the Jim Crow activity that we see is done by privately owned businesses. The buses, if a bus was owned by like Greyhound, it's a private institution, and they can tell the African Americans you have to sit in the back. And this is a very difficult thing for the African Americans to overcome, is the state action doctrine. Now, the next ruling that the Supreme Court gives is in 1896, and it is a very, very famous and very important ruling that they give. The separate but equal doctrine is delivered in the majority opinion in the very famous court case of Plessy versus Ferguson, which was heard in the Supreme Court in 1896. The situation with Plessy versus Ferguson was that there was a gentleman that was African American, and he was on a train car, and the train car that he was on was getting full. And since the people who ran the train car knew that this gentleman was African American, as the train car got full, he was asked to leave that train car and go to the black-only train car that was in the back of the train. He went to the other train car, but eventually this gentleman would sue the company saying that making me go to a blacks-only train car violated my 14th Amendment right of equal protection of the law. Well, what happens is the Supreme Court hears the case, and by an 8-1 vote, an overwhelming vote of 8-1, the Supreme Court says, no, making African Americans go on a separate train car designed just for them does not violate the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. What the Supreme Court says is just separating the races doesn't constitute discrimination. You can separate the race, and as long as you provide both races with facilities, then that separation is going to be considered equal and is not going to be discriminatory. Now, you got to understand here that this separate but equal doctrine creates precedent. And if you remember what we talked about precedent being, what it does is it starts off by saying that separate facilities on a train car is fine. But if separate facilities on the train car is fine, then separate facilities in schools are going to be fine. Separate facilities in courthouses are going to be fine. Separate facilities everywhere are going to be fine. And from 1896 until 1954, every time there was a case in the United States dealing with racial segregation, the Supreme Court applied their stare decisis policy of let the precedent stand, and they said racial segregation is fine as long as you are providing facilities for both races. Now, we got to be careful here. We're not saying that the train car that you provide for the whites has to be identical to the train car that you provide for the African American. Basically, the Supreme Court is saying, as long as you have an African American only train car that is pulling out of the station the same time that the white train car is pulling out, that's going to be considered equal. Even if the white car has, air conditioning and cushioned seats and all of those things, and the African American car is only a car with a couple of seats on it, the Supreme Court is still going to consider that equal. The same concept when we look at segregated schools. The Supreme Court says you have to provide a school for whites and a school for African Americans, but you don't have to provide the same quality of textbooks. You don't have to provide the same quality of schoolhouses. You don't even have to provide busing for the African American. All you have to do is provide a school for them. So understand the separate but equal doctrine. Basically what the separate but equal doctrine is creating a situation where the government is allowed to sponsor discrimination or segregation against the races. This is a very important concept you need to understand, that the separate but equal doctrine creates something that we call de jure discrimination. De jure discrimination or de jure segregation is government sponsored. The government is okay. And this has huge ramifications for African Americans, because think about something. If I, as the representative of the state of Missouri in this class, if I am discriminating against you and you don't like the way I'm treating you, you have the right to go to my department chair, the dean, the president, maybe all the way to the governor if you want. But if all of those people were to say, it's okay for Kevin to discriminate against you, how would that make you feel? That would make you feel like you have no way to be successful in the world. So if an African American is wanting to go to a white school because it's got better education and they want to improve their education, it's the government telling them no. And if the government tells you no, who do you go to? You go to the Supreme Court. And what did the Supreme Court say? The Supreme Court, as the ultimate authority of the government, said it's okay for them to discriminate against you. This separate but equal doctrine really makes the outlook for the African Americans in this country after 1896 very bleak. So make sure you understand the concepts of state action doctrine and the concept of separate but equal. We're going to talk in the next section about how the African Americans were able to overcome the separate but equal doctrine.